Dr. Joseph Spero is professor of international politics and political science at Fitchburg State University. He focuses on international security and international relations, particularly European and Eurasian security, government decision making, and simulation of decision making in the midst of geopolitical crises. Before assuming his post in academia, Dr. Spero served as senior civilian strategic planner for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, J5 Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate in the Europe NATO Division, and that was from 1994 to 2000. He served as National Security Analyst at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, 1990 to 94, and finally, Deputy Assistant for Europe and the USSR at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, 1988 to 1990. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, International Institute for Strategic Studies, and the Atlantic Council. He received his Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and authored, among numerous publications, Middle Powers and Regional Influence in 2018 and Bridging the European Divide in 2004. We are pleased that Professor Spero is joining us today, as tomorrow his colleagues will host a party on the occasion of his retirement at the end of this semester. Dr. Spero, the virtual podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Len. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you, with all of you. And what you see on the slide is a map that I realize can't even keep pace with the change occurring because you have countries listed who are members from top to bottom, and basically, the reference squares, either North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO nations, as well as European Union or EU nations, and then with the colors coordinating just EU members or just NATO members. And of course, for you all eagle eyes, you can see that this map, which I thought was pretty comprehensive, and it's pretty difficult to find good maps. I can't yet design them myself. But Sweden and Finland are, of course, now NATO members, and they don't have, if you will, the horizontal lines through them to indicate they're both EU and NATO members. But I just want to emphasize that. You also see a box that has the makings of Ukraine's colors, and it has Mackinder microcosm, because I originally titled this talk How the Poland and Ukraine Bridge became the Europe's defensive backbone. But this is an illustrious forum on Mackinder, and my talk is about a microcosm of that, because his geopolitical heartland thesis and really the extraordinary contributions he made to our understanding of geostrategy, not only geopolitics, and especially geography, which I love, I've always loved, and I keep impressing upon the younger generations who I've really benefited from teaching just how important geography is. And you can see that I've put a Mackinder microcosm kind of in what I would call the heart of what might be categorized these days as Eastern Europe, or Eastern, or shall we say, the real borderline for Europe and shall we say, uh, Russia and its post-Soviet successor states, or shall we say post-Soviet nations, like you can see on the screen, Belarus, Ukraine, even if you push things farther towards the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and of course you've got those who might have been considered captured in the Soviet sphere and really oppressed, the Baltic nations of uh, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Uh, the heartland, to me, for the purpose of my talk, is really about Poland and Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, if I can define it that way. There are debates among geographers, historians, political scientists, especially international relations types, about what designates which part of Europe. But to me, it's the heartland, and I have the initials up there in front of Mackinder in that little box, that rectangle, ZB, which is to remind me to uh, honor as well as reference Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I did have uh, really the pleasure to get to know to some extent in the 1990s. He played a great role with his publications where he did bring in the Heartland thesis uh, about Ukraine and Poland and Russia, of course, going back centuries through the communist and Soviet era, and especially in the early to mid 1990s, the post Soviet era, the post Cold War era. Uh, and Brzezinski always said, whether in person or in lectures or in publications, that without Ukraine and its territory, Russia should never be an imperialist power, or it hinders Russia's imperialist uh, interests. And that always struck me as I was coming up in the 1980s, as well as in the early 90s from uh, my master's degree in Central East Europe and Soviet studies, if you will, in the 1980s from the University of Michigan. And then I took a break and I started my government journey. Uh, but I also wish the following I'm going to say, I tell my students never to attempt, but if I had to do it again, I probably would. I did my PhD full time while I was working in the Pentagon full time. And my first son was born in the middle of this. So it was a very hectic time, but literally running between Johns Hopkins SICE and the Pentagon at least was doable. Brzezinski was teaching at SICE at that point, as well as being at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But I also got to know him, especially when I started working on these issues intently. And so in my PhD dissertation, Mackinder figures prominently. My first book, which Len referenced, Bridging the European Divide, is based a lot on this. And I'm so grateful that this type of scholarship is recognized prominently in a forum like this. I really wanted to give that kind of overview to delve more deeply into my presentation, because I'm going to fill the screen with much more analysis for you to consider. But that's really where it starts for me and continues to this day. So let me start with let me see if I can just move. So when we look at, shall we call it the heart of Europe, we look at Europe from, let's say, the West, Germany through northern and central and Eastern Europe through Poland and into Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. That to me, in many ways, becomes the kind of the center, if you will, of a lot of centrifugal forces. Let me just make sure. So I'm going to start this presentation. I'm going to circle Poland for starters. Uh, and I thought it would be important to start with 20 January 2025, because that's when the second Trump administration begins. And for Poland, who is now on, shall we say, people's minds more so than it may have been uh, 30 years ago, uh, even during the Solidarity or Solidarność era of Pope John Paul II and Lech Walesa. Uh, Poland to me has always been important throughout the centuries, but I want to focus my presentation since the new US administration took office. And I want to start to lay out for you ways that I think are important to explain not only Poland's role in Ukraine's survival, at least what may become of Ukrainian territory, but also Poland's role in European security, which, as you see on the screen in the box in the upper right, the blue, black, and colorful box, uh, European security transforming. We know that U.S. military forces have been deployed on Polish territory for some time. Uh, they've been temporarily stationed there for years now, but there have been a significant number of forces there uh, in the lead up to uh, the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And naturally, Poland is seeking US forces to remain deployed. But that, like everything these days, is questionable as to whether that continues. I should say that there were a number of us in as early as 1990 and 91 at National Defense University, as Len said, at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, and my close colleague from those days, Jeff Simon. Some of you may know him. He basically, is one of my mentors, and we worked together. We were talking to the Poles in Warsaw on those early visits about U.S. forces being stationed on Polish territory, because the Poles always wanted U.S. forces there. And I think if you had spoken with Dr. Brzezinski, he would have agreed. Well, they are there. The question is, will they remain? When you look at the borders of Poland and you see the arrow from Russia, toward this region, let's just look at Poland briefly and which crucial countries border Polish territory. It's really quite crucial. You all understand this, but many perhaps don't. If we start from Poland's west, you see Germany, of course, and then as you move southwest, Czechia, as it's called these days, or the Czech Republic, and southeast Slovakia, and then you start to include Ukraine, northeast Belarus, and Lithuania. And then you have Russia literally cut off from itself in Kaliningrad. And of course, you've got the Baltic Sea uh, also contiguous to Polish territory. These are regions, or a major region, quite vulnerable, even with the fact that Poland and Lithuania, as well as Slovakia, Hungary and Romania as well. These are frontline NATO nations, European Union nations. They get talked about more and more these days. There are not only US, but other NATO nation forces that exercise, train, and sometimes deploy for lengthy periods of time on these other nations' territory, but Poland is front and center. And Russia's cut off from itself. And Kaliningrad, as we in this forum appreciate, is quite a militarized region and could be used in an operational sense for future challenges, certainly toward Poland and the Baltic nations, as well as into the Nordic region. So the Poles, as we know, and in their foreign policy and defense planning are scaling upward significantly. So they're projecting a doubling of their armed forces over the next several years. That's toward a half million in both reserve, but hopefully in Poland's mind, more active duty based potential. Poland's the third largest force in Europe behind the US and Turkey. If scenario plays out where Poland really does increase its force structure in this manner, especially its ground forces to these levels, they'll surpass Turkey. And if the United States potentially withdraws from Europe, let alone, dare I say, NATO, uh, then Poland becomes the largest force in NATO. And I don't believe Poland is thinking about withdrawing any kind of forces from any kind of territory at this point. So we keep that in mind. A nuclear uh, weapons umbrella, if you will. You've heard talk about this. Polish leaders, from the Polish president, primarily some time ago, perhaps even around the time that the French president Macron began to articulate publicly about a nuclear security umbrella approach, especially in a more autonomous Europe if the United States uh, were to pull away, heaven forbid, take its nuclear umbrella from Europe. But the Poles have been very candid. They're not shy. They're very vocal publicly. They've done so for 1,000 years like this. I want to admit up front that uh, my ancestry is Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian. That's for starters. I've got a number of other bloods from Europe in my backgrounds, but I've been to this region a lot, and I cringe at times when I hear the Polish president saying we want a nuclear security guarantee from France and Britain should they decide that they have to step in and provide that. That's important for us at least to consider, especially if the United States decides it's going to with withdraw such types of guarantees. So I want to start to discuss, based on that Polish, uh, at least that brief overview, how the Poland and Ukraine defensive bridge emerges as perhaps a European security backstop. I want to underscore that I'm not arguing that Poland and Ukraine can stop uh, a potential invasion, potentially from Russia through Belarus, Suwalki Gap, however one wants to game it out. I defer mostly to my RAND colleagues who do these kinds of uh, simulation games over the decades these days. But when you look at the relationship between these two independent, sovereign, and at least to some extent, in Ukraine's case, through its capital, Kyiv, and parts of Ukraine that are still under Ukrainian control, a free Ukraine, what we should keep in mind are some following historical facts that are very important. I'm going to bring Germany into the presentation, as you can see there with its ring, which intertwines with Poland. When you look at the reconciliations in this region of Europe, which have occurred in the last nearly, I would say, 60 years plus. The post-World War II Franco-German reconciliation is monumental, and within an emerging NATO in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and of course, a European coal and steel community, which evolves into a European economic community and a European community, and today an EU. That reconciliation, as we know, remains crucial for peace and stability, but also economic advancement and bringing Europeans together. It's really an extraordinary experiment that I hope continues on the European continent for well beyond our lifetimes. The post-Cold War Polish-German reconciliation remains crucial and often underestimated. And if you go back to 1989, when Poland peacefully led the revolutions, and this was in the spring and summer of 1989, some months before the Berlin Wall fell, and the Polish Solidarność movement started negotiating with the Polish Communist government a way to form, if you will, a post-communist transition, partially free elections, and the beginnings of how Poland would make its move westward again and trying to rejoin Europe free and sovereign and independent. The first Polish post-communist foreign minister, who actually was foreign minister for the first several Polish governments, post-communist governments, Krzysztof Skubiszewski, was an expert on Germany and had actually published some extraordinary documents, including a book on Polish-German relations. And this is before 1989. He was also an international lawyer who had spent time and never had joined the Communist Party at The Hague in the International Court of Justice. Well, when I saw Skubiszewski emerging in my early days of government, and of course my scholarly interests, and as I kind of made my way towards starting a PhD, I couldn't help but observe how Poland and Germany, a harsh, harsh history throughout the centuries, even before World War II, how they were trying to reconcile. And the model was the Franco-German reconciliation. And that was crucial, as well as Skubiszewski trying to reach out to the emerging post-Soviet neighbors of Lithuania, in those days, Belarusia, Ukraine, and even post-Soviet Russia. And those are important factors for us to keep in mind because they start to lead to how Ukraine begins to become part of these circles in many ways, which includes Germany and other countries in Europe. recognitions. I'm going to abbreviate, as you can see on your screens, the countries by their formal abbreviations. So this bridge notion, and perhaps as opposed to balancing and bandwagoning, which we international relations types love to bat around as to which one should be used to explain alignments and nation states and how they interact, survive, but also prosper. The Polish-Ukrainian or POUA recognition is quite essential for us to understand how this can become a defensive backbone for Europe today. 1991, as you recall, Ukraine becomes independent. The USSR collapses by December 1991. Poland's the first country to recognize Ukraine's independence. And although the Poles and the Ukrainians connected in many ways culturally, historically, traditionally, linguistically to a great extent, have also a very harsh and difficult relationship, certainly in many respects. But I'm focused on their defense and, if you will, foreign policy relationship. And I want to show you what these particular years on the screen in this yellow and black box mean, which they start to turn toward the year 1994, which may not seem like a critical juncture for many, like 1991 or 1989, or the other years on the screen there. But 1994 for me sheds enormous light on how today the Polish-Ukrainian relationship and the Polish-Ukrainian German relationship takes shape, as well as relationships with virtually every country across Europe and the transatlantic link with the US and Canada. 1994 is when NATO, which had already integrated a unified East and West Germany into NATO in 1990 and 91. So people forget that NATO's always enlarging, but NATO did enlarge to the east in 1990. I mean, East Germany became part of Germany, and Moscow agreed to it. And sure, there are stipulations out there, and I've had my interactions with scholars who say that there were agreements not to do this and that on this and those territories, but NATO's always remained open to countries which want to join it. NATO doesn't invite them unless they want to join. 1994, the NATO Partnership for Peace process begins, and that is not necessarily a membership, launching pad, but it's a way to have NATO nations start to educate, train, exercise with countries that are not NATO members. And that's very important. I was actually put in charge in the Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate of the Joint Staff when I joined in 1994. The Partnership for Peace money that was allocated by the US Congress and put into the Joint Staff's budget, even though the Joint Staff didn't request it. And in those days, at least, when money is appropriated and allocated, we follow the laws in those days and we actually spend the money. So that money it has been started to get to use to pay for partnership nation costs that they couldn't afford. This is US taxpayer dollars that were authorized for the United States, for example, to fly C-130 aircraft to these countries and pick up for example, their platoons with all their equipment to fly them to exercises on other European nation territories. Those costs do add up, and I never thought I would be doing financial management in as a strategic planner in the joint staff, but money is power. You can have a lot of words and a lot of speeches, but if you have money you can spend, and this was 1 year money and it had to be spent or you lose it, you learn quickly how to establish policy. 1994 was the first Partnership for Peace exercise, and it was on Polish territory. And it was in September 1994, and I had joined the Joint Staff European and NATO Division a month earlier. But I had watched this exercise taking shape. For one thing, it was the first time since World War II that German military forces returned to Poland, but this time they returned peacefully to train and exercise in a 3 week long kind of training and peacekeeping based exercise, which also included search and rescue and even humanitarian relief type aspects. Ukraine sent a platoon. This is very small scale, I realize. Russia was invited. They didn't send a platoon, but they did send a military intelligence representative. But we had about 12 or 13 NATO and the first signatories to the Partnership for Peace process at NATO exercised together. And that on a former Soviet military base on Polish territory, mind you. This was a milestone, and for me, really defined a lot of my PhD, which I was starting to write at the time, as I was also actively part of the U.S. interagency process to see how these countries could become partners. But of course, the Poles, who signed up early for the Partnership for Peace, as did the Ukrainians, the Poles said, when are we going to get into NATO? We want to be in NATO. And it would take 5 years, 1999, but Partnership for Peace provided that process. At the same time, the Poles and the Ukrainians, through the PFP or the NATO Partnership for Peace process, as well as their own bilateral relationships with together, as well as with others, with the United States, they developed through hundreds and probably now thousands of training events, exercises. You started to see how these countries operated together in Bosnia in 1995, and then Kosovo. Then you recall Poland became the third military sector in Iraq in 2003, along with Britain and the United States. So Ukrainians are constantly working with the Poles, especially through their militaries and the challenge of how the generations emerge from communist era leaders in the military, as well as the foreign policy uh, bureaucracies in Warsaw, as well as Kiev, and how the next generations arise. You fast forward to 2014 when Russia invades Ukraine for the first time militarily, or shall we say, undercover in Crimea, of course, and the beginnings of Eastern Ukraine. And today we have a war that's over 10 years old. By 2022, uh, on February 24th, you have the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as you know, and as I referenced a while ago. But at this point, you have 35 years of a partnership between Poland and Ukraine, which is extremely important. And there are realizations to this, not only partnership, but you have integration occurring militarily between these two countries operationally in some ways. And I'm going to explain that for the remainder of my presentation so we can move faster toward your questions. I would even argue that they've been allies for some time bilaterally, and they would agree. They're integral, especially along that Polish-Ukrainian border. And Poland and Germany are as close as they've ever been militarily, as well as other countries in the Nordic region, as well as Western and Southern Europe. This is quite essential to understand how could they become a defensive backbone. And there are considerations as well as reconsiderations. And this is where the talk mostly focuses, whether you're in policy circles or academia, even in business, as well as the, shall we say, non-governmental sectors these days, security guarantees. Does a minerals agreement apparently signed within the last 24 hours between the United States and Ukraine factor in security guarantees? That's a big question mark. Can NATO provide security guarantees? Can the European Union provide security guarantees to Ukraine, or what becomes of Ukraine? And if you track, which I do diligently daily in the Polish press, in the Ukrainian press, in the US and European uh, media spheres, what's coming out of Warsaw, Kiev, especially, the Poles are in the forefront. Their prime minister, as well as their president, their foreign minister. I know some of these people from 35 years ago when they were just getting their starts, like the current Polish prime minister. The current foreign minister is one of my oldest colleagues. They're in the forefront of saying Ukraine does need security guarantees. And uh, it would be better if an international institution like NATO would grant it. But in the interim, we're going to do everything we can to integrate and ensure that possibility becomes more seamless at a certain point. And so, how do they do that? How does Poland reinforce not only NATO and with the European Union, its 6-month rotational chairship? Poland is currently winding down its chairship. Donald Tusk spends a lot of time in Brussels, as he does in Warsaw and elsewhere. But how do they bridge Europe? That's really my focus. How do you bridge effectively, especially with war clouds always on the horizon? And you do so peacefully for however long possible. But what are the mechanisms? How do you put that in place? Well, one of the ways you do that is not only do you maintain U.S. forces, including uh, not only the Kentucky-based Fifth Corps headquarters, which has been revived over these last years, but it also has a forward deployed element in Poland, the Fifth Corps headquarters. And mind you, U.S. forces, including elements from the 82nd Airborne Division, a division in which my oldest son served a couple of years ago. He's been to Poland with me, but he didn't have the chance to go when those elements landed in Poland before February 24th, 2022, some weeks before. Fifth Corps headquarters forward deployed before full-scale Russian invasion in late February 2022. That's important. Air defense to augment the Polish armed forces. That's been developing since the 1990s, but really accelerates after 2014 between not only the United States, but other NATO nations helping Poland, as well as starting to help Ukraine, which includes Poland and others significantly so. So it's equipment, its weapons to Ukraine. In the immediate aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Poland is literally funneling across the border more so than anyone, equipment, weapons, probably covertly trainers. And I can tell you that I happened to be on a research trip in early March 2022 that had been scheduled for a while in Warsaw. And so I was there 2 weeks after the full scale invasion, and I thought I was in a movie, a World War II movie, literally trains of uh, migrants coming off, uh, you know, the platforms, people, mostly women and children, carrying dogs and cats, little kids, places flooded with refugees. And mind you, Poland, as you know, was taking in and still does refugees by the hundreds of thousands in weeks' time. Uh, the benefit of having 1 million or so Ukrainian uh, guest workers in Poland over the years before 2022 means you have ready-made places where people can live. There were no refugee camps. I think this is the first time ever that that's happened in Poland. Ukrainians were integrated seamlessly into places to live. They were given 3 months' salary at the border of Poland and Ukraine so that they could afford rent, buy food, and their kids were put into Polish schools overnight. And since, for example, my mother-in-law survived uh, the Holocaust in Poland and uh, was able to migrate eventually to the United States in 1951. These types of stories resonate very loudly. And this continues today. These are the types of major equipment that Poland, among any number of nations, the US, of course, but Europeans prominently, they provide. You can see mobile anti-aircraft, the longer range missile systems, attack drones, howitzers, mortars, tanks, armored vehicles, fighter aircraft, attack helicopters, infantry fighting vehicles, rocket launchers, grenade launchers, ammunition. I mean, it's a long list, but when you do that, and a lot of this is just the equipment that Poland had, but Poland's been trying to replace that equipment with more modernized equipment, primarily whether it's European, US, South Korean, uh, to ensure that it can still meet its responsibilities for its contributions to NATO, but it's trying to give Ukraine everything that is possible without weakening its own Polish defenses. And this is all part of contractual as well as treaty type based agreements that Poland and Ukraine have uh, basically promulgated over the years, not just the last several years. You also have on Polish territory NATO's biggest and what we would call longest standing unit in Central and East Europe. It's called the Joint Force Support Center. And it's quite significant and integrated into the NATO Alliance's command and control structure. And this started some time ago. This is about a 20-year evolution on Polish territory. But when you look at the map of Europe, you look at Finland, Germany, and Turkey in terms of how you would look at the north to south perimeter and the command and control structure of NATO. and how nations, especially like Finland and Turkey on those front lines, are significant military powers. And you combine that with this NATO, basically a major force and support center on Polish territory, you can start to see there's a real integrated or integrated command structure, not only in NATO, but also for how Poland and its outreach to Ukraine takes shape. So I want to wind things down with some final thoughts. And let me just see if I can do this. Let's, oops, just kidding. Some may know about this hub. It's probably the most critical element between Poland and Ukraine, and it's expanding. It's now a Poland NATO hub. It's in the region of Rzeszów and a smaller town called Jasonka. It's an airport. It's in the eastern region of Poland. It's about maybe 10, 15 miles from the Ukrainian border. It provides not only air, but rail and road transport, and it's indispensable for border resupplying uh, as a route, but it's providing battlefield material and manpower to Ukraine. It's also the gateway for where a lot of the leaders who visit Kyiv work through, because they're not going to fly into Kyiv these days. And that corridor, which I've seen, I mean, you go on these modernized, really wonderful highways in Poland these days, and there's just convoys constantly, military convoys, just delivering all kinds of supplies. That's really crucial. Poland's air defense system integrating rapidly and effectively and more significantly into Europe and NATO air and missile defense across the Euro-Atlantic continent. Well, however challenging it is, there's plenty of discussions happening between Poles and Ukrainians and others about how do you ramp up from Patriot, shall we say, missile defense systems or other missile defense systems that might be mobile into more of an air defense structure? Quite challenging, but military planners and operators are quite effective when given not only budgets, but equipment and the manpower to put them into play. And you've heard that the Poles are the highest GDP investors in defense, if one wants to measure, which I think always becomes very controversial, measure one country's contribution to the alliance. I think that gets overdone, but the Poles take it quite seriously. And toward NATO, not only with their nearly 50 military assistance and training packages to Ukraine, but they're the largest GDP percentage contributor to NATO. They're approaching 5% already. They're projected at about 4.7% defense right now, which is significant given where they're located in Europe and what they're doing. And lastly, we shouldn't underestimate how important and how it bolsters this decisive, if you will, emerging alliance, the Polish-Ukrainian alliance, the security agreement that they signed in July, which focuses a lot on this shared border between these two countries, which comes into play significantly when you're looking at Belarus and how Russia is using Belarus potentially and increasingly as a launching pad for its exercises and potential operations, and of course, Kaliningrad. These types of uh, integral and integrating aspects matter. And lastly, I'll leave you with these thoughts. The news has us ricocheting every day for where a possible ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia might emerge, whether negotiations can happen. Do we get some type of peacekeeping or peace enforcement process going? Depends where and how in Ukraine. Is that even feasible? You hear talk about a reassurance force and or a deterrent force, a coalition of the willing. This changes almost in its dimensions on a daily basis, but it's important to underline it. Where's the Ukrainian territory accord of the future? How is that going to be decided? Will the United States continue to play a key role? Will the Europeans, through the EU, but also through NATO, have a seat at the table? And that really concludes this, pardon me, this lengthy presentation with the fact that the Ukrainians are already negotiating their European Union integration that may take shape in an association agreement, which they were trying to do in 2014, which led to the initial, I believe, Russian invasion of Ukraine. But you'll notice in the recently inked mineral agreement between the US and Ukraine yesterday, uh, that EU membership, which I thought was really quite important, jumps out at you for the US not, and the US is not an EU member, but basically supporting Ukraine's uh, efforts to join the EU. We'll see what happens with NATO.